I'm delighted to welcome you all here to the Oak Room of the Mansion House for the third in our Oak Room lecture series. This evening's talk will be by Graham Hickey, the CEO of Dublin Civic Trust, speaking about the conservation of 18 Ormond Quay and 68 Arran Street Upper, or Arran Street East, I should say. But before introducing Graham, I just wanted to let you know a bit more about the series. Some of you have been here already, so this will be slightly repetitious. But the idea of the series this year was the first time we've done it, and we really felt that there was a need for a sort of throughout the calendar year for a series of talks that profile really important work that's taking place in Dublin. That work could be building conservation, as Graham is going to talk about this evening. It could be research and new publications, and even sometimes just new ideas about heritage and what is heritage. So over the span of the year, we're going to have a series of talks that look at a range of different topics. Our next speaker will be on the 10th of April, which is only just over less than a month away, and that is going to be by Kieran Owens. And Kieran was the founder and editor of the Dublin Event Guide, which is a free sheet for cultural events in Dublin that basically closed down in 2008. And he's going to be talking about Dublin's, I suppose, lost culture life from the 70s to 80s and 90s, and looking also at the legacy of what happened in the 70s and 80s and how we're still living with the positive legacy of those cultural activities today. So we hope that you'll stay with the series. The series is going to be recorded, and we'll of course put those up on DCC's YouTube channel. So the other thing I need to do is to just offer a few thank yous. First of all, Abigail O'Reilly, who's the Graduate Heritage Officer who would have welcomed most of you here this evening. Without her, the series wouldn't be happening, so I'd very much like to thank her. And also to the guys here in the Mansion House who've been very supportive of us and hosting all of the talks. So it's a really interesting series of talks. So now on to Graham Hickey. So we're extremely honoured that Graham agreed to give a talk to us this evening. Any of you who are on YouTube or Twitter, Graham will probably be no stranger to you. He's a masterful communicator and narrator of building conservation, and he brings with him a huge amount of knowledge that I think will come across in his talk this evening. And Graham, as some of you will know, is the CEO of Dublin Civic Trust, an independent charitable body that works to preserve and promote awareness about Dublin's built heritage. Graham is a regular writer on architectural heritage, the built environment and the development of Dublin, and is an Honorary Fellow of RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects. Dublin Civic Trust's latest conservation project at 18 Ormond Quay Upper received Europe's most prestigious award, the European Heritage Award, the Europa Nostra Award in 2021, and it's now entering its second phase of restoration with the mid-18th century building to the rear on Arran Street East. The history and conservation of these two buildings will be the focus of Graham's talk this evening. So we're, as I said, deeply honoured that Graham's here this evening, and if you'd all like to join me in welcoming Graham to the podium. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles, and good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today, and thank you all for coming. I thought you'd all be watching the 6-1 News. We have serious competition today on the other side of the wall here. I think there's a lot more political intrigue over on Kildare Street. I hope you can hear me okay. I'll just bounce that up a little bit more. It's lovely to speak here as well in the Mansion House, in the centre of the civic life of the city for over 300 years. I've always loved this room. Christine Casey calls it dour. I like it. It's almost the ceiling kind of evokes the new courtrooms in the forecourts that were built at the same time as that ceiling was put in about 1930 or so. So it's lovely to be in the Mansion House, which was described fairly disparagingly in 1782 as in no way suitable for the mansion house of the chief magistrate of the great metropolis, a large old-fashioned house of brick. It doesn't get much better in 1825. Unprepossessing, says Wright, being fronted entirely in brick and built after a design that could never have been pleasing to the eye. And then just to pile it on, in 1920, Francis Ball says, a low edifice unworthy of his appropriation and ill according with all the public buildings in the metropolis, And it's in a recess in Dawson Street, another mean brick front, which is actually incorrect. It was rendered by 1920, and distinguished principally by being the most unsightly edifice in the street in which it stands. And really, just to put the nail in the coffin, Thackeray, having just passed his lordship mansion, a queer old dirty brick house with dumpy urns at each extremity and looking as if a story had been cut off it, a Hrazé house. Dear, oh dear. We will come back to the Mayoralty House a little later in the programme, because there's a few connections with 18 Ormond Quay. We often begin any kind of description of Ormond Quay with this really magisterial view of the city in the late 19th century from the Lawrence collection, photographs in the Lawrence collection or held in the National Library. It captures the essence of Dublin City, the DNA, these tall brick buildings, all jostling for attention with their street frontages along the river. It captures the hierarchy of Dublin buildings, the street buildings interacting with the major public set pieces of the 18th and the 19th century. The Ormond Quay Presbyterian Church, some people mightn't recognise, was built in the 1840s and burnt in a fire in the 1980s. And some of it still survives in the office block by Grafton Architects that stands on the site today. But ultimately, what's so interesting is, 18 Ormond Quay is slap bang in the middle. We were pretty lucky how well photographed this building has been over the years. But it captures the essence of a building tradition. And tradition in many forms of life and society today has got a bad name, often for good reason. In a building tradition, it's kind of an unconscious way of doing things, a set of rules that gather pace over time, and everybody does them unthinkingly, often because it's a sign of tried and tested formulas. And in here we have an inherently brick city in spades. We have a city that's really built of brick, dressed in granite, and then finally trimmed in Portland stone. You could almost say the three themes of the city. And I suppose it's that type of building and it's that type of urban assembly that we were kind of very struck with when we had the privilege of collecting the Europa Nostra Award for 18 Ormond Quay in Venice. The connections, the universal connections of urban development, where perhaps each individual element is unremarkable, but collectively they form an extraordinary human achievement. So conservation is more than just the artifact, it's about the collective assembly, which is always writ large in the urban environment. And we have that in spades here in Dublin, how each generation, how each century kind of takes the tradition, slightly changes it and evolves it, and you end up with that gentle sense of local identity and sense of place. And it's that type of building that we've always been interested in, Dublin Civic Trust, over the many years. We've produced many publications, a lot of you will be familiar with, looking at the fine grain of the city streets. We've done area-based studies, some with Dublin City Council, some with business organisations, looking at area-based conservation. But I suppose the most visible strand of what we've done, and 18 Ormond Quay is a key part of it, is to lead by, or try to lead by demonstration in acquiring key buildings of their kind, and to educate and create awareness about best practice conservation. This was a lot easier in the 1990s than it is today. It's a lot more difficult now. You are competing with developers and shady actors and everybody in between and trying to purchase property in the centre of Dublin. Most people have very different motives about what they want to do with buildings compared with a building conservation charity, as you can imagine. So it's not an easy task. And this is just an array of the buildings that have been done over 30 years, give or take, mostly by my colleague Geraldine Walsh and many of her colleagues. Some done in partnership with Dublin Corporation, with Dublin City Council, and some with some institutes as well, in finding new uses for really a remarkable suite of buildings ranging from the 17th century right up to the early 19th century, including 21 Angel Street, the oldest house of all, which we'll reference a little bit later on. Our last building that we were in is Barnwell's Shoe Shop at number 4 Castle Street, which was an early 19th century Wide Streets Commission era building, and one of the last buildings in the city that still has its traditional shutters on the ground floor shop front. So about 7 or 8 years ago, we up sticks from the comfort of that premises to this train wreck on the north banks of the river. And I suppose to the intrepid architectural researcher, this was exciting. There was little glimmers of, clearly the windows were quite small up at the top, which indicated mid-18th century or older. There was kind of biscuity Roman cement lurking underneath the green paint, which was suggestive of early 19th century modifications. And I suppose looking at the round, I mean, even the NIH is confused. It says circa 1790 for the two buildings, these two conjoined buildings. It's a good stab. The building tradition in Dublin was very conservative from, say, 1750 to 1850. So very little changed, really, over that time. Really, through our researches, we managed to pin that the front building dates to 1843, as late as that, and the back building dates from the 1750s. We haven't actually pinned a date, but it's probably sometime in the late 1750s. A brief potted history. This is one of the earliest maps of Dublin, Bernard de Gom's map from 1673. It captures the brand new, newly embanked North Quay of Ormond Quay Upper and Lower, and extending into what would become Bachelor's Walk. Ormond Quay, 18 Ormond Quay is on the site of the circle there. The lands were literally, they were bubbling, awaiting the speculative development that would come on stream. This is just 50 years later, Brooking's map from 1728. And you can see that the construction of Jervis's Bridge in 1675, the Ormond Bridge, where is now the forecourts, about 10 years later, opened up all the lands on the north side of the river for speculative development. And I think what's really interesting, actually, is the set piece. The elephant in the room, right in the middle there, which is the, get the pointer working there. I'll point the Ormond Market right in the middle, which was one of the grand civic set pieces on the north side of the river, developed in the late 17th century. It had open colonnades on the ground floor, living accommodation above, almost a French type market that went through another refurbishment in the 19th century and then gradually fell apart by the early 20th century. We're right here on the corner with Arran Street East. The type of buildings that were populating the city at the time, certainly the grander type, looked something a bit like this. This is the King James Mint, which was on Capel Street. It was a newly built house, or recorded as newly built in 1689. You can see this kind of early signs of Georgian classical type design. It's a brick-built house. Sash windows. The sash windows we think were actually retrofitted later on. This is a drawing of the house retrospectively. There's a large modillion eaves cornice, big steeply pitched roof, dormer windows, massive chimneys, all very typical, the London type of house that populated the city at the time. Just by comparison, 21 Angel Street, built in about 1667, just literally applying those principles to it, plunk in the roof on top, it begins to make a bit more sense of those shabby buildings you're now looking at on Angel Street. Applying those principles to what we think, how the site evolved at 18 Ormond Quay over the years, I think people find these kind of interesting. They're conjectural, but they're based on the types of buildings that existed in the city at the time. We know the width of 18 Ormond Quay, fronting the river, has remained constant since it was built in the 1680s. Probably a low type house, 2.5 stories over basement. The chimney was probably on the spine wall between the front and the back rooms, which was typical of that early period. We're on a bit firmer ground. The first kind of lease record that we have is 1744. David Reed was building a new good brick house on the site, so only about 60, 70 years later after the first house. This is probably a gable-fronted Dutch Billy type house, which is the kind of the archetypal good house that was being built in the city right up until the mid-1750s. As late as that, the city was predominantly gable-fronted. And that house is captured on the corner on John Rock's map in 1756. What's interesting about the map, you can see just behind 18 Ormond Quay, there's 3 houses on Arran Street. Now, our investigations of photos and maps and everything over the years, we can't find evidence exactly that these are quite substantial, deep, 2-room deep houses. And certainly the house that's behind 18 Ormond Quay today is only 1 room deep, which leads us to believe that literally John Rock and his team of surveyors were surveying here exactly as these houses were being built, where the foundations were laid, and he wasn't actually sure how the houses would end up. Or the houses had been built, and he made suppositions about how deep the houses were, because you couldn't actually see from the street how deep, or which was a common problem at the time in drafting maps. That's David Reed's house, built in 1744, what we think it looked like. About 10 years later, in the 1750s, a man called Thomas Marr, a gentleman, bought the house in 1753, and it seems for two purposes: to extend the house to make more money, and to speculate on the back plot. Up until that point, Peter Keenahan, who's an architect and an extraordinary researcher on the early city, who's on the board of Dublin Civic Trust, he posits that most of the houses had fairly open plots, literally open back gardens with stables along the quay, and that 3 smart houses were built on Arran Street at that time, of which only one now survives, which is the photo that we saw a little bit earlier on. When I say house, we're pretty sure this was always an extension to the river fronting house, and hopefully that'll make a bit more sense as we go along. When we bought the building about 8 years ago, the big box of lease documents came with it, and it was gold dust to be able to go through all of those before they were lodged with the PRA. And there's a lovely connection with the very room that we're sitting in today. You'll notice this is a lease from Arthur Dawson to James and Galbraith Hamilton in 1789. And that is for the Thomas Marr house and his extension that was built at the back. Arthur Dawson was the grandson of Joshua Dawson, who built this house in 1715. Arthur transacted the lease in 1789. There's his signature, there's the wax seals, which are wonderful to have. And it would appear that Arthur Dawson's uncle invested in the Ormond market. So he actually owned a lot of the quay frontage of Ormond Quay and part of the Ormond market behind, and then it transferred to Arthur Dawson, the grandson, a little bit later on. We think the building was probably modified at that time. It might have been classicised, and we think that's probably when the shop front that as we know it today in 18 Ormond Quay was introduced in the 1780s. It's been mixed around with since, but we think that's when the shop front arrived. The first recorded occupant in this building is John Conroy, who was a tavern operator. We have John Conroy here tonight. And John Conroy and his wife Anne operated a tavern there for about 20 years, right up until the building was rebuilt in the 1840s. And the really lovely thing is this newspaper notice that was brought to our attention by a researcher called Simon Chadwick. And he records the hotel and tavern run by Conroy, a very respectable house it was too. It had good beds, excellent beds, well stocked with wines and spirits and so forth. But the NB is the very interesting point. Mr. Rennie, the celebrated performer on the Irish harp, attends every evening. Well, Mr. Rennie is the celebrated Valentine Rennie, who was the leading revivalist, I suppose, a reviver of the traditional Irish harp in Ireland in the early 19th century, because the classical harp had completely taken over in the 18th century, in the neoclassical period, and Rennie and his acolytes were a small and hugely influential group who revived traditional Irish harp playing, along with the Egan manufacturers in Dublin. And Mr. Rennie, and here is a contemporary portrait of him. He was born in Cushendall in Ulster. He learned his trade in Belfast and the Irish Harp Society that was created in Belfast, and he trained and played there and instructed there for about 20 years, eventually travelling all over Ireland and particularly making his money in taverns, hotels and major concerts in Dublin City of the Regency period. And when I mentioned the Regency period, on the other side of the wall here, the great round room of the Mansion House that was built in 1821 for the visit of George IV to Ireland, built in 6 weeks flat? Or extraordinary turnaround in the construction of the building. For that event, Valentine Rennie who is playing in Conroy's Tavern at the time in 18 Ormond Quay, was one of the 4 main harpists who was engaged to play for King George IV, literally on the other side of the wall here. And it's kind of tantalizing to think, this is kind of the 19th century OS map, that to get into the round room at the time, that little loop you see at the bottom was actually built a little bit later after Rennie. But literally he would have actually come through the entrance of the door into the round room was literally just here. So the only way to come through is to process through the front door, through the drawing rooms, through here, the Oak Room, to play for George IV on the other side of the wall here in the round room. So it's a lovely connection. And just to highlight that there was a description, there was about 400 people who dined in the round room at the time. And you'll just notice at the end, the whole was graceful and grand and went off, except the music, which was bad, poor and scattered. Now we like to think that there was a lot of there was choral singers and other instrumentalists at the time. So if anything, the harp music was probably playing as an undertone throughout the meal. So that was probably the more stable aspect of the music on the night. So a lovely connection with 18 Ormond Quay. Getting back to the north side, this is a Conroy's Tavern. The building that stands today is ostensibly 1840s, and it all made sense in our title deeds. The building at that stage was in a very decayed and ruinous condition and in danger of falling, and the building had to be rebuilt in the space of 6 months between 1842 and 1843. So we think the front building was effectively collapsed to the ground. The high status shop front, if it existed at the time, was probably retained and rebuilt into the lovely merchant premises that's there today. In our title deeds, there was a lovely map that came with it, which is really very frustrating. If you go to the Registry of Deeds today, frustratingly, maps are usually disassociated with the memorials of deeds, but if you have the original title deeds, the maps are usually still with them. So that's how this was in the box, as it were. And you can see the intended merchant's grocer shop on the ground floor and the drawing rooms on the first floor. So a nice drawing of a typical merchant building at the time. When it came to restoring 18 Ormond Quay, we used every documentary record we possibly could. So this is Shaw's Pictorial Directory of Dublin from 1850. 18 Ormond Quay is the second last building on the quays to feature. We were incredibly lucky when you zoom in on it. This is the building just 7 years after it was built. You can see there's ventilation grills underneath the window, underneath the shop windows, and the entrance is in the middle, so it told us where the entrance originally was. We drilled through the Lawrence collection photos. This is about 1880. You can see this kind of ye olde worldy timbers kind of painted onto the side of the shop front at that stage. So maybe aesthetically things are beginning to fall apart a bit by the late Victorian period. This wonderful view, which is also Neil McCullough's new book compiled by Valerie Mulvin. This is the funeral of Thomas Ashe in 1917, and it's the funeral cortege that came from City Hall, I think the very long way around, probably down O'Donovan Rossa Bridge, along Ormond Quay, to the Pro Cathedral, and then out to Glasnevin. And again, it kind of captures really the essence of a living city. You can see almost every upper floor is occupied, well-maintained shop fronts, the brasses are all probably polished. And 18 Ormond Quay, which by this stage was the Douglas Hotel, is lurking there in the background. And that's just the Douglas Hotel a bit later on. And the Watts brothers were the final occupants, the famous hunting, fishing tackle shop that occupied the building for about 30 years, up until the year 2000. I'm sure some of you might remember it. And the family regularly call in as well. So when it comes to restoring a building of this kind, I'll just keep an eye on the time here. It's important, number one, to look at the documentary record as we did. Secondly, is to open your eyes and look at the building itself and try to make sense of the layers that are there. So this was a lovely etched glass from Edward Corcoran, who was a grocer in the building in 1902. He popped up in the trade directories. The stairs looks older than the building itself. It looks like it might have dated from the 1780s when the building may have been modified. So it's nice that elements were recycled, as was commonly done. This is the horror show of upstairs, a scene very typical of above shop in Irish towns. It's all there though, and that's the key thing. The cornicing, most of the lime plaster is there. The back windows had been blocked up with breeze block over the years. In the back building, it got much more exciting. The joinery is of the mid-18th century date. This solitary early sash window was clinging on for dear life. It had a Mannix Flynn poster stuck on it a bit prior to it, with big chunky glazing bars. So we gently prized that down and bubble wrapped it. This lovely early cornice, 1750s Rococo type cornice. This is of the kind of Parnell Square quality, Merrion Square quality, lurking on a little back street. This was the shop, lined out with beauty board and everything for a gallery space as it was used for over the years. And when we got picking at it, this is David Skinner, the wallpaper expert. Some of you might know him, having a look at some of the early decorative layers that were lurking underneath all of that cladding. So the building really was a huge drag on the area, and we're so used to it at this stage, it's kind of hard to detach yourself and look at how bad it actually was. There's a really vibrant community behind, and this was a big imposition, a pretty ugly grey carpet on the quays as well, and there was buddleia growing out of it. And the biggest concern of all, as the next slide demonstrates, you can see with the buddleia coming out, there's a very disconcerting lean on the side wall. It was leaning by about 110 mil, give or take about that, which is quite extreme in engineering terms compared with the bottom on the ground. And no surprises, looking at the two buildings in section or in elevation, you can see where the extreme bulge was. And that came about really due to poor maintenance. The rainwater hopper over the years, spilling over, getting in behind the pebble dash, rotting the bonding timbers that are buried in the walls, causing the walls to move, and also kind of pretty poor practice over the years of removing walls internally, so the outside walls didn't quite have the restraint that they were originally designed to have. It kind of got worse when you got inside, when you took off the kind of plasterboard liners of the shop front. The already fairly skinny shop piers were literally about 1.5 bricks, 1 2/3 inside, which was even narrower than they were outside. So our engineer kind of got pangs of horror when that was revealed. I suppose there was a couple of options about what we could have done from an engineering point of view to resolve these things. One could be to dismantle the entire wall onto the scaffolding and rebuild it, as might have been done in the 19th century. The other option was to try and restrain it in situ, and this was the system that was devised to do it, which is a kind of a 4-story grid of steels applied onto the inside face of the staircase wall, and then that big grid was then pulled back to the rest of the building or held back with ties running through the floors. You can see also all the red lines. These are what's called kind of a heli-fixing system. So every 5th brick course, nowadays there's very kind of low impact, kind of fine stitching you can do with conservation today by stitching brickwork. So the brick turns into a beam-like arrangement by putting the steels between the courses of the brick. It turned out we didn't really need most of that, so that was actually omitted. And also all the blue patras plates that were called up, you often see those on the outside of buildings as well. We were able to actually hide those within the body of the wall, which was a revelation to us that could be done. So a little stainless steel hoop was used in place of the patras plates. So it didn't get an outbreak of leprosy on the outside of the building with patras plates. That is a tie. They're pretty low intervention. These are huge, very long, flexible things, and they go all the way through the floors, and then they're tied into a little steel plate. And at regular intervals along the building, that's how the grid was pulled back into the building. This is an example of what's called a picture frame steel arrangement that had to be introduced in the shop in order to give a bit of stability to the ground, to the lower level of the building, before the upper parts of the building could be worked on. In order to get some of these elements in, some of the more familiar elements had to come out. This is the Edwardian entrance vestibule going to the workshop of Lamb's Tongue, our joiners. Generally, you don't want to be doing this, but we were going to realign the entrance anyway back to where it originally was, and the steels also needed to go in. And Lamb's Tongue are a reputable conservation specialist company, so we knew they would do well by this. So this was brought to their workshop and restored in situ. But broadly, you want to try and keep fabric in the building wherever you can. Very often it gets lost, can get damaged, people lose track of it, and very often it doesn't end up back in the building for various reasons. Some of the floors had to come up. This is kind of structural ply that had to go in underneath the floorboards. Even just the process of lifting and relaying floors is kind of a specialist skill. The boards have to be both lettered and numbered, so you know what row they're coming from before they go back down. And then the big challenge, the fun, I suppose, was how on earth do you remove this fur coat of pebble dash that's covering the building? We didn't have to do it. I mean, we could have just put Dulux weather shield on it and kind of hope for the best. There was some water ingress coming in, as you saw, in a few different areas. But we wanted to do right by the building and contribute something back to the quays. And also, we were given the assurance and the confidence by our contractors, Nolan's group, that this could be done. So they undertook a few trials. And I should say, of course, the architectural team and our conservation architect for the project was James Kelly of Kelly & Cogan Architects in Smithfield, who was also on the board of Dublin Civic Trust at the time. And James led this project with such interest and enthusiasm and expertise. And it was really James and Shane working together that gave us the confidence that this could be removed. And the reason it came off so easily is that underneath the outside layer of pebble dash, there was a layer of paint underneath it, which had been applied before the pebble dash ever went on. So it didn't actually adhere to the brick as well as had been intended. So then we had a second task of removing all that gunk off the facade. That was mostly steamed off using a DOF high pressure steam hot system, which is great. Nowadays you can do this type of thing with conservation. You know, back in the day you were sandblasting or other horrendous things that really damaged the fabric of the building, but this is so low impact. It also enables you to use the least amount of chemical as possible as well. So the steam and the heat really does the hard work for you. You think that's finished, but in fact there's lots of chips of paint on it as well, and that all had to be chipped off for a couple of days by two guys, like a woodpecker-like in tipping away at the brick. It revealed problems along the way, so which kind of validated our removal of the pebble dash, that actually there was structural deficiencies, like window heads that had to be rebuilt. And it's the little details that count. So this is a sole surviving sample that was hiding behind a street sign of the original wigging, of the original fine Irish joint. So wigging is the term for the dressing up of pretty crude brickwork with fine lime joints to give the impression of fine kind of Dutch or continental style brickwork. You can see it's like a dental implant really. It's using the raw bone of the brick and then building it up with a coloured mortar, so in this case an ochre mortar to match the yellow brick, which is applied over the fine ribbons of lime mortar. We kind of went through the motions of doing the samples, but at the end of the day, the building tells you what to put back, and there was evidence of the original ochre colour, so that's what we went back to. And this is the extraordinary process of wigging underway. It's a better detail than the English form of tuck pointing as well, because in the English system you put the colour in first and then you kind of draw the ribbon on afterwards. In Ireland, the ribbon is actually built out of the substrate, so you kind of jam the joint with your base mortar, then you cut the ribbon out of it, and then you apply the stopping mortar over. So technically it's a much stronger joint, which we were very happy with. And then there's lots of tidying up that happens after. Just around the coins as well, we didn't want to draw lines around the coins, so Shane Nolan, we came up with this silvery mortar so that the coins would be a little bit more gentle in how they interacted with the brick, which is very nice. And the important thing is that you are looking at the brick. You brush back the coloured mortar as much as possible, so a bit like wallpaper, you get the texture. So when you stand back, and we kept the wigging sample as well, when you stand back you get that mottled appearance. You're not looking at a plastered wall, you're looking at a bit of texture. And this is the tradition of the average street building in Dublin, and this is the standard which we're now capable of doing, and there's lots of contractors who are now doing this, and this is something we really need to be advocating on a big scale, and the Conservation Office in Dublin City Council is really is leading the charge on that, which is really, really heartening to see. I think what's really nice about this, it kind of looks newly built, but it looks old at the same time, which is, it kind of straddles that divide quite nicely. I'll just fly through some of the images. Yes, we kind of went back to the Lawrence Collection photos in the 19th century. Our chimneys have been chopped down in the 1980s. And so we literally zoomed in, we counted the courses of brick that were in the Lawrence photos, and we rebuilt them back to their original height. They never had chimney pots, as was common up until give or take the mid-19th century. A lot of buildings didn't have them. They were open to the skies. In the 1980s, because some of you might know an architect called Merlo Kelly, who she was dealing with a chimney piece supplier, a gentleman in his 80s, and he came into us. And he was the man in the 1980s who was ripping out the chimney pieces on the first floor in 18 Ormond Quay. And he said the day he was there, as he called them, he said 2 gangsters were up on the roof, dismantling the chimneys and flinging all the bricks down into the flues, which was the easiest way to get rid of your rubbish. You just threw it down into the chimney flues. And to this day, most of the flues are still rammed with brick. So there was no point in opening them up. There was no point in advocating for open fires in the middle of the city. So we decided this is perfect. We'll lime cap them and we'll give back the aesthetic of what the building originally had. So it's one of the few buildings in the city that now have 2 flat top chimneys, which Leinster House had up until recently, and now after the restoration, for some bizarre reason, it now has chimney pots. I don't know why. But so the shop front is the other detail. That's the shop front that we inherited. We had very little to go on. The glass was modern. Some parts of the window frames were historic, and the entrance, of course, was located to one side. And it had a modern door. If it had a nice Edwardian door, we'd be more iffy about retaining it. But it had a completely modern barn door from the 1970s. So James really went to the ends of the earth, and I went to the ends of the city in looking for precedents of what we could find to restore the shop front. And I do use the word restoration. This is a restoration. Conservation philosophy very much kind of advocates a readable intervention if you're making an intervention into a building. We take the view generally that, in a street building, the tradition of street buildings, it's a modest tradition. And in a city that is completely denuded of traditional details, we actually need to be reintroducing these elements. We could have done very smart kind of Milan-style single-pane windows with a bronze surround or a chrome surround, but we wanted to bring back the tradition of Dublin shop joinery. Also in a more sustainable way as well, to use timber windows. So we came up with the principle of the ventilation flues or ventilation grills that were in these actually do exist in different parts of the city. This is the former Green's bookshop, or Howard and Mays on Clare Street. This is beside Shaffery Associates premises on Lower Ormond Quay. This is an archive photograph again showing grills. And we hit on gold with the Apache Hostel on Eustace Street, where Bushy Park Ironworks took an imprint, and I think we got them cast in a Thai foundry and got them reinstated. This is the windows being manufactured in Lamb's Tongue. We managed to salvage what we could of the shop windows, the lovely cable mouldings that are there, and they were integrated into the joinery. And we gave them a simple oak-grained finish, which is literally just dragging the brush, a common finish in the mid-19th century. There was evidence over each arch of a little wrought iron pin, which we took to be oil lamps, not gas lamps, which would have come much later on, but oil lamps. And this is the wonderful blacksmith, Paul Devlin. Paul Devlin is currently almost single-handedly restoring the railings of Mountjoy Square. It is probably the largest scale, highest quality conservation of any railings in the country, never mind in Ireland. It's outstanding what he's doing. And he made these wonderful, so I kind of drew up a typical James Moulton oil lamps, and he got these wonderful copper hats spun in Belfast. And this is the amazing kit of parts he literally just drew on the back of an envelope. It's just incredible, traditional craft skill. And we kind of invented these lamps using these Jerpoint globes. And we think they were, and also traditionally oil lamps actually in Moulton prints were quite tight up against the buildings, quite awkward. So we're actually quite happy to keep them quite tight up against the arches. This is the shop before and after, with the cast iron pillar awkwardly reintroduced into the middle of the plan. I am very uncommercial. I'm as awkward as possible in putting elements back where they should be. This is the entrance vestibule, repositioned on the new entrance. I should just say as well, we thermally upgraded the building where we could. So in some of the upper floors where we had lost historic finishes due to fires and alterations over the years, this is the second floor. This is a calcium silicate board, which was applied over a cork lime plaster. So there's two forms of breathable thermal insulation that was applied onto the walls. And this is DB plaster, and Ecological supplied the materials for it. On the top floor, we use a different type of, the one that I mentioned. This is the cork lime plaster. You've probably seen it. It's become very mainstream now in recent years. And this goes directly on like a mousse, directly onto your wall. You get a very good wrap around windowsills and that type of thing. And that's the final finish, which in Italy, it's been used for about 40, 50 years in Italy, and is often left in that lovely unfinished state. And we kept as much as we could. You know, these TV programs where it's a rite of passage, where you buy the building, you come up with a grand plan, and then the diggers move in and they're pulling down ceilings, they're pulling down walls, almost just as a rite of, that's how you do a building. It is not how you do a building. This is how you patch repair a building with lime plaster. You keep the lath and plaster ceilings, which are usually about that thick. They're like an iceberg. I mean, they're hugely heavy. We should be, from a sustainability point of view, keeping the material. So this is an example of a ceiling being saved using a wire and washer method, and that's all skimmed over. And that's kind of a room before and a room after with the joinery elements reintroduced. And you know, this is the level of detail that you need to do with a traditional standard building. We don't operate in an era of tradition anymore. We operate in a period of specification. And in many ways, even if you have a specialist heritage tag in your name as a conservation joinery firm or whatever, it doesn't mean that you operate within a tradition of 1790s windows or specific types of mouldings for doors. They have to be drawn. And we're losing the battle on a big scale to proprietary windows all over the country. It's tragic when you go to Irish Town and you see all the mainstream brands of catalogue windows being introduced, all for the sake of a bit of specification and a bit of consideration of the tradition that exists in our towns. And this is the type of thing you often see. This was on Capel Street, lovely 18th century fabric being pulled out of unprotected buildings, I have to say, on Capel Street. So I whipped them out and split the Siamese mules in two, and we used one in our ground floor and one of our basement, and it worked perfectly. And then we don't often finish buildings in Dublin Civic Trust to a full interior spec. In this case, we're very grateful to receive a grant from the Apollo Foundation, the Decorative Arts Foundation, and Alec Cobb in particular of Newbridge House was instrumental in. He really loved the idea of the merchant house and bringing back some of the modest kind of middle class elements of a typical building of that kind. The story of Ireland in the 19th century, for the most part, is oak graining and wallpaper. And it's not necessarily to everyone's taste, and we often have a view of things being very Wedgwood in Jane Austen kind of way. In fact, most of the 19th century things were pretty interesting. I wouldn't say sometimes vulgar, sometimes quite refined. But oak graining in particular, the graining of all of the joinery, literally like a pub front. That's how most joinery was actually. And if you scratch most shutters or skirtings and anything in an Irish building, you'll come back to that tobacco colour of the early to mid 19th century. So it provides a foil, a kind of a natural, even foil to crazy wallpapers for the most part. And this is the layers in 18 Ormond Quay. You can see the 1840s oak graining, so the light colour is kind of the base of the graining, or else an undercoat, and then the two coats that provide for the oak graining. The green is probably late 19th century, the sludgy colour, 1910, and then titanium white paint from the 1970s or the 80s. That's it. Kind of 4 times the building was painted in 170 years. That's a shutter on the first floor. David Skinner presented us with the delights of Irish wallpaper manufacturing of the mid-19th century. These are mostly held in the National Archives in Kew in London. These huge books which are full of samples that were sent over for patents to the Patent Office in London, and very few people have actually looked at them. And there were a riot of Irish design and Irish pillage design from France that were then sent over for patenting. These are some of the examples. This is James Boswell of Bachelor's Walk from the 1840s. And this is James Boswell's premises, just a few doors away from O'Connell Street, where his main manufactory and retail shop was. So he kind of presented us with everything under the sun. We were kind of saying, no. So he kind of came up with, chose the more polite, more palatable papers. So this is a lovely, simple example. This was made in Capel Street in 1854. This is a laser printed edition. It's almost like Nicholas Moss kind of spongeware, a nice simple pattern. This is the top floor before. This is the top floor halfway through. We used plasterboard. We didn't have the budget for lath and plaster. We think it's perfectly acceptable to use plasterboard if you've lost ceilings in all but the most significant of buildings where it's worth going to that effort. This is a wallpaper that was another connection with the Mansion House. This wallpaper was literally found across the road, the house next to Butler's Chocolates, so the Butler, right across the road from us here. It's an early 18th century house, and this is an early 19th century wallpaper that he found. And he recolored it to match the kind of the grey tones of the river outside. So brown furniture is kind of paired with these wallpapers. You kind of begins to make a bit more sense, actually, these buildings, when you introduce a bit of texture, a bit of pattern, and a bit of the contrast that these interiors originally had. And then this is James Boswell. He made this paper in 1841, the year before the building was rebuilt in 1842. So it was literally made down the river, and David Skinner reproduced, screen printed this for us, and it has a beautiful texture to it. And yes, we did want to, well, I wanted to do oak graining in here, but it was designed by committee, so we decided on a kind of an oak room colour, kind of a dark oak colour in the joinery there. I will very quickly, as that's kind of before, and that's with the manners put back on the street. And I think what's particularly nice is that the judges in Europa Nostra, they kind of noted that so many of the themes of the restoration of this building were transferable to other projects, which was very heartening for us, because that's exactly what was the main aim of the project, really. In the last 10 minutes, the back building is more interesting. We're only starting on it. There is a video here, but I'm going to try it. This just gives you a context of the building. And I think what's interesting about the back building, as I said before, it is literally only one room deep. So when you're looking at it from the air or from the street, you can see that there's almost no windows on the back. It never did. And the two houses next door are missing. The gable was completely rebuilt in concrete in the 1960s when the other houses were demolished. But the front and the back elevations are both very much 18th century, and it has lost its lovely steeply pitched roof that it originally had. And there's our lovely city and the context of it. So yeah, making sense of all that, coming back to a reality, we were conscious that there was lots of layers here. The carcass of the building is 1750s. There was obviously kind of 1840s Roman cement there. And then there was later alterations. These kind of slit windows had been introduced at some point in the 20th century. Once we really got digging with it, for the most part there was kind of beauty board under that green paint in the windows. One of the windows was 1970s. One of the windows was older, but in very poor condition on the top floor. And we really surmised that the lovely big window, the Roman cement architrave, was part of a kind of a grand makeover of the building when the front building was rebuilt in 1842-43, and they just continued the shop front over the 18th century building at the back. So therefore, it made sense to try and reinstate that big 1840 shop window, and it would also make more sense of the accommodation inside. That's the building as we inherited it. Just for context, that's what we think was originally on the back site at the back, with number 68 as it's called, an extension to the front. And then the middle house was 13 feet wide. And there's a 13-foot wide house on South William Street, pretty much facing Paris Court House. And you can literally pace out, so you can count the paving slabs, and it's exactly 13 feet. So there is a precedent for that type of house, and then a slightly wider one at the end. That's what we could make sense of the building in terms of bringing it back to, with a few tweaks in a way that would preserve as much fabric as possible. We think that's probably what it was originally, in some shape or form. We think the ground level has also risen quite substantially, so the basement floor might have been fully exposed originally. So if you see that layer of windows there, that kind of the one up from the bottom, they were the drawing room windows of that house, and the lovely Rococo cornice for that now missing room still survives running around inside. So it's a very exciting kind of grand designs potential with the building. During the dark days of COVID, we were very fortunate to receive a grant from the Heritage Council when a lot of the COVID recovery funds were coming out. We were shovel ready with this aspect of the project, and so Lamb's Tongue kind of went out of their normal course of work and went into the demolition business and removed all of the breeze block, reinstated the sash windows based on the sole surviving original sash that we saw a little bit earlier on. This is a lovely little survivor story, that this lovely sash. It had its original glass. Even the sash frames, for the most part, and most of the sash windows still survived underneath the breeze block. When you held the sash up to the light, you can see all of the lovely panes of cylinder glass that were still within it. Once we got poking at the sash boxes, the original 18th century timber pulley wheels, pre-cast iron, pre-brass, these rosewood pulley wheels within oak boxes still survived. Lamb's Tongue managed to get these working, and that sole surviving sash is still operated on these pulleys, which is very nice. These are the extra sashes that were made then to fill the gaps. In this case, we wanted to introduce thermal upgrading. So these are double glazed sashes. And amazingly, you probably can't barely even tell the difference. The bottom window is the original sash with the original glass, single glazed, and the top one uses slim profile double glazing, which is only 12 millimeters thick or thin. So it really is an imperceptible difference in this case. So we're really happy to get that thermal upgrade while retaining the original fabric. In trying to bring the building back to its original appearance, we went through the same process, the removal of the pebble dash. Again, it revealed the same structural problems. Again, it revealed the same white paint that was lurking underneath the front building. And sure enough, this pretty grainy RAF photograph of the building from the 40s or the 30s, it's a glowing white box, so it's just before the pebble dash was put on. We went through the process of rebuilding all the window reveals, which often get cracked over time. You can see the parapet had been rebuilt in the Edwardian period with kind of a shiny orange-red brick, typical of that time. So we had to work out how we could integrate that brick with the older 18th century brick underneath. This brick is a century older than the brick of the front house, and it wasn't as hard. The front house is a pretty crude brick actually, but it was a hard brick. This was softer. So this was the solution that we came up with. We found the original detail, which was a penny struck flush joint, which is where you fill the joints and then you just literally strike a line through it. In order to do that, we had to build up a lot of the bricks. So we came up with this kind of in-between solution of building up the bricks and then pointing them up afterwards. We brushed back as much of the mortar as possible to reveal as much of the brick as we could. This is Brendan underway in Nolan's group repointing. These are the big neoclassical swags of Hessian protecting the brickwork. It kind of looks like a Lutyens mansion to our conversation a bit earlier. It looks like a new build executive mansion in this scene. But that's the brick detail brought back. On the parapet, literally there's a process called tinting where you use a lime wash and a coloured wash with a paintbrush, and you go along and you just tap the bricks just with a touch of a darker wash to integrate it more seamlessly with the brick of the lower floors. And this is some of just the lead work from Chrono Groofing, and that's the facade revealed. Incredible that this was lurking underneath and it was capable of being restored. Again, a real tribute to the confidence that we could put in Nolan's group to do this quality work. Also, it is just worth noting, see, we rebuilt the reveals, so you can actually see some of the evidence of that. So we tinted some of that new brick as well to try and better integrate it with it. And if you see it, so what? It's kind of an honest repair of what was there. And very quickly, just the shop front. We had suspected that there was probably a big head somewhere, a big timber beam that was probably the head of the big 1840s shop front before the windows were punched up in the 20th century. And sure enough, we revealed it as soon as the modern windows came out. This huge timber head. This is Gavin and James looking bewildered at this massive timber head. So we knew where the head of the window originally was. We were able to recreate that. So this is concrete. It does have a role in conservation. These are very thin, very minimal spanlight concrete beams. And we infilled the big hole with salvaged brick. And this is the shop front being recreated as well. So this is Nolan's group using a modern equivalent of Roman cement, or prompt as it's known. It's incredibly fast setting. If you don't put a retarder into it, it can literally set in 5-6 minutes. It's terrifying to see it setting in front of your eyes. If you put a retarder in, you get about 30 minutes out of it. So it's quite difficult to use in summer actually as well. So this is the mouldings being built up. That's the frieze being applied. The top of the window, we could then strike that based on where the window head originally was. We could continue the frieze all the way along. We lime washed it. We thought we'd get away with 2 coats of lime wash. 5 coats of lime wash went on, and it could probably do with another one again. And this is it at the moment. There's still kind of salts and minerals coming out of that'll settle down over time. And it looks like it has always been there. It's actually extraordinary to see how a bit of texture brought back. We kind of decided to leave, where it had fallen away over the years, that for the moment at least we'll leave that raggedy appearance because it demonstrates how the building has evolved, including the window opes on the lower level. Remember the 3 drawing room windows that were here, 1, 2, 3. You can see there's one of the heads of one of those drawing room windows above, which is really nice. And then finally, just for the window, again, around the corner on Molesworth Street, this is a lovely 19th century view of an early 19th century shop front that still survives. You probably know that trio or the pair of them on Molesworth Street. And this is a really important shop front. This is one that rare as hen's teeth. Old glass, old glazing bars, it's all there. And this was designed to host shutters originally as well. So James and myself, we took the measurements of that window. The detail that you go into, you have to draw these windows completely in order to make sure that the tradition survives, really. This is it arriving with lamb's tongue. Here's the window going in. And it worked to perfection. Literally, the proportions of the window on Molesworth Street literally matched exactly the window that we had here. So again, it is restoration, but it is within the tradition of the Dublin joinery tradition. So then just finally the door. This was actually completely covered up with a cement board, and it was only when it was revealed, it was actually a tilting, pivoting fanlight that was lurking underneath it. For the most part, this door case was in excellent condition. It needed very little repair. For the most part, it's cosmetic. That's the door. The door was being repaired. A lovely piece of pitch pine used on one of the stiles. It's a really tall, skinny door, actually. It's quite an awkward object. And that is the story of a Dublin door case from start to middle to finish. And we decided on a single block colour. Traditionally, that's how joinery was treated, without trims and without picking out of details. And actually, you can see the lovely awkward stairs inside the first time passing the fanlight. It never worked. It still doesn't work, but it's all the better for it. So that's the finished product. And I'll just show you that in the past few days, we used aerial photos to reinstate the roof. There's the last supper of the team of working out how the hell do we tie this building together. There's kind of the structural consolidation of the building was required, so we kind of used the roof project in the past few months as the mechanism by which a kind of a belt could be put around the building to stabilize it. This is the warts and all view of the inside of it at the moment. There's been so much 20th century intervention in part of the building that it gave us license under our new architectural team, Lots Architecture and Richard McLaughlin, to use a very minimal amount of concrete on one of the 18th century walls, which would give us a complete ring beam around it. It would also enable us to do a completely traditional timber cut roof. So on that basis, it made absolute sense to run a single concrete beam. And so we used the aerial photographs to reinstate the chimney and brick selection. And that's pretty much the roof at the moment. And literally in the past few days, literally I'm just from this lovely Welsh Penryn slate, traditional leaded ridges, and the chimney reinstated. Lovely detailing. This is chronog roofing, super. They've done houses around the corner here on Kildare Street. Lovely bespoke little vents that they've made, the roll details, which are typical of Irish roofs. And this is the next part of the project, is refurbishing this building as the home of Dublin Civic Trust. We don't need a big space, but we do need a permanent office for the first time. So the idea is to occupy most of the rear building as our permanent premises, which will enable us to look at options for revolving the capital out of the front building and invest it into another project. And we were kind of scratching our heads wondering, who do you get to occupy a building as crazy as the back building? And the estate agents just looked at us and said, you. So it did make perfect sense to do it. So that's currently what we're looking at, and there's lovely 18th century details and lots of texture. What's so interesting, there's loads of decorative layers in this building, including 18th century wallpaper that really hadn't survived in the front building. So I think I will leave it there. Thank you very much.